Tonight we descend beneath the dust of southern Mesopotamia into a land where the earth itself remembers. There, under the baked plains of what is now Iraq, beneath the ruins of cities whose names once trembled on the lips of kings, archaeologists uncovered not golden crowns, not jeweled masks, not marble statues of conquerors, but clay, small pieces of clay, broken, darkened, hardened by sun and fire. At first glance, they looked like nothing more than rubble scattered across a dead world, yet pressed into their surfaces were signs, narrow wedges, strokes, and angles, made by a reed stylus in wet mud more than 4,000 years ago. And when those signs were read, humanity heard one of its oldest voices speaking again. The voice was Sumerian. It was not the voice of a primitive people stumbling blindly toward civilization. It was the voice of accountants counting barley, priests serving gods, kings claiming destiny, mothers singing laments, scribes copying myths, and citizens arguing over wages, fields, marriages, debts, and justice. It was the voice of a world that had already learned to organize labor, measure time, build temples, command armies, write laws, and imagine the universe as a fragile arrangement between gods and mortals. For centuries, the story of Sumer lay buried and answerless, adrift in the silence of the desert. Travelers saw mounds rising from the flat land like sleeping beasts, but few understood that beneath those mounds rested the remains of Uruk, Ur, Nippur, Lagash, Eridu, and Kish. These were not mere settlements. They were among the earliest cities on Earth, places where the human experiment changed shape forever. In the 19th century, European explorers, local workers, antiquarians, and later trained archaeologists began cutting into those mounds. Stratigraphic excavation, still young as a discipline, slowly revealed layers of occupation packed one upon another. Mud brick walls emerged from the soil, temple platforms appeared, seals, bowls, statues, drains, graves, hearths, and tablets came into the light. The desert did not surrender its secrets willingly. Wind filled the trenches. Heat pressed down on the skin. Salt rose through the soil. Yet the work continued. At sites like Nippur and Girsu, at Ur and Uruk, the spades found archives, thousands upon thousands of tablets. Some were complete, others shattered into fragments no larger than a fingernail. Many were administrative. Some seemed dull at first, nothing more than lists of sheep, grain, workers, beer, land, and temple offerings. But in these lists, there was a revelation. Civilization was not born only in palaces and battlefields. It was born in storage rooms, counting houses, temple courtyards, irrigation canals, and scribal schools, where memory became record and obligation became law. The scientific anchor of this lost world did not come from legend alone. Radiocarbon dating, ceramic typology, stratigraphic excavation, lithic analysis, archaeobotanical remains, and more recently, genomic data from surrounding ancient populations have all helped scholars place Sumer within the wider transformation of the ancient Near East. Long before the famous kings of Akkad and Babylon, long before the pyramids had become the eternal symbols of Egypt, southern Mesopotamia was already alive with urban complexity, and still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. The Sumerians called their land the land of the civilized lords, a place of canals and temples between the Tigris and the Euphrates. They believed the gods had chosen cities as their earthly homes. Each city belonged not merely to its human inhabitants, but to a divine master or mistress. The temple was not only a place of prayer, it was an estate, a warehouse, a workplace, a political center, and a doorway between worlds. In the cool shadows of its sacred rooms, offerings were prepared. In its outer courts, grain was measured and labor assigned, high above the surrounding houses. The temple platform rose like a mountain made by human hands, a symbol of order raised against the flat and dangerous horizon. To understand Sumer is to enter a place where gods and mortals once walked the earth together, not as a childish fantasy, but as a complete way of knowing reality. The people who built Sumer were not lesser minds. They were our intellectual and philosophical equals, living beneath different skies, inside different systems of meaning. Their world was animated by forces they could not ignore: floodwater, drought, disease, birth, death, crop failure, royal violence, celestial movements, and the terrifying uncertainty of life. Their myths were not idle tales told around a fire. They were instruments for thinking about power, labor, suffering, and the place of human beings in a universe that seemed both magnificent and merciless. Among the most startling texts are those that speak of human creation. In them, mankind is shaped not as the beloved center of existence, but as a solution to a divine problem. The gods desire relief from toil. They require workers. Humans are fashioned from clay, sometimes mixed with divine substance, created to carry the burden of labor, to dig canals, raise food, maintain temples, and serve the cosmic order. It is a strange and unsettling vision. Civilization appears not as a triumphant march of freedom, but as a sacred arrangement of duty. Here lies the forbidden power of the Sumerian texts. They do not flatter us. They do not place humanity comfortably above nature. They remember a world in which people built greatness while bowing beneath necessity. They speak of kingship descending from heaven, of cities chosen by gods, of floods that erased entire ages, of rulers who reigned for impossible spans, of divine anger, human grief, and the endless struggle to preserve order against chaos. When the tablets were first deciphered, scholars realized that some stories known from later traditions had deeper roots in Sumerian and Mesopotamian literature. A great flood, a chosen survivor, a divine assembly, a paradise-like land, a descent into the underworld, a heroic king searching for life beyond death. These were not simple copies traveling unchanged through time. They were living traditions, reshaped by language, empire, and faith. Yet their antiquity forced the modern world to reconsider the long memory of civilization. Imagine the moment of discovery. A tablet is lifted from the earth, still marked by the hand of a scribe whose name is lost. Dust clings to its lines. The signs are patient. For millennia, they have waited in darkness while kingdoms rose and vanished overhead. Then, under lamplight, in a museum, laboratory, or archive room, a scholar traces the wedges and begins to hear a sentence formed in a dead language. A ration of barley, a hymn to a goddess, a lament for a destroyed city, a schoolboy's exercise, a king's boast, a myth of beginnings. Nothing about this is ordinary. The clay tablets of Sumer are among the most profound archaeological discoveries ever made, not because they give us a single answer, but because they multiply the questions. Who were these people who transformed mud into cities and symbols into memory? What did they believe they owed the gods? Why did writing begin with accounts and end by preserving poetry? How did temple economies shape the earliest states? Why did human beings gather in such numbers in a harsh alluvial plain where rivers shifted, floods threatened, and survival demanded relentless cooperation? Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. New excavations, improved readings of tablets, residue analysis, satellite imagery, environmental studies, and ancient genomic research continue to refine the picture. But the central mystery remains as powerful as ever. In the deep past, on the wide banks of the Euphrates and the Tigris, human beings crossed an invisible threshold. They entered the age of the city. They bound memory to clay. They gave their gods houses and gave their kings divine language. They created a world whose ruins still shape our own. So tonight, as the desert cools and the stars gather over the ancient plain, we listen. We listen to the reed stylus pressing into wet clay. We listen to the temple drums sounding across the rooftops. We listen to workers in the canals, scribes in the tablet house, priests in the sanctuary, mourners beside the broken walls, and kings proclaiming that heaven had chosen them. We listen to the first civilization speaking from the earth, not in a whisper of fantasy, but in the measured, durable, astonishing language of clay. And from that clay comes a story both majestic and disturbing. Humanity's first cities were not simply built from ambition. They were built from fear, devotion, labor, memory, hunger, and the belief that above every wall and field, unseen powers watched. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And as we begin this long descent into the oldest written civilization on Earth, tell us where you are watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. Between the Tigris and the Euphrates, the world was made of water, mud, and light. There were no mountains to protect the southern plain, no deep forests to shelter the people beneath green darkness, no walls of stone rising naturally from the earth. Instead, there was a vast alluvial country, low and open, where the horizon stretched like a blade in every direction. In summer, the heat shimmered above the ground until distance itself seemed to melt. In winter, the rivers swelled and wandered. In the marshes, reeds grew taller than a man. Wild birds lifted from the water in sudden clouds. Fish moved beneath brown currents. Date palms leaned over channels cut by hands long dead. This was the land that gave birth to Sumer. To modernize, it may seem almost impossible. The southern Mesopotamian plain was difficult, unstable, and in many seasons unforgiving. Rainfall was scarce. The soil could crack beneath the sun. The rivers did not behave like obedient servants. They shifted, flooded, withdrew, abandoned old beds, and carved new ones through the flatness. Fresh water was life, but too much water could drown fields and houses. Irrigation made abundance possible, but irrigation also carried danger, for evaporation left salts behind in the earth. Over generations, fields could grow tired, white, and bitter. Yet precisely because this world was so demanding, it forced human beings into new forms of cooperation. A small household could plant a garden near the river. A village could dig a modest channel. But to bring large fields under cultivation, to guide water across distances, to drain marshy ground, to repair banks after a flood, to store grain, to settle disputes over flow and access, communities needed planning. They needed labor on a scale greater than one family. They needed memory, measurement, authority, ritual, and trust. In the deep time of the plain, the canal became more than a technology. It became a social spine. The early inhabitants of southern Mesopotamia learned to read the moods of water. They watched the river color change with silt. They felt the dampness in the air. They recognized the season when fields must be opened, when embankments must be strengthened, when sheep and goats must be moved, when the date harvest must be gathered, when mud bricks must be shaped and left to dry. The land demanded attention. It rewarded negligence with hunger. The great rivers carried more than water. They carried earth itself. Fine sediment washed down from distant highlands, year by year, flood by flood. They laid down the material from which the plain was formed. In this sense, Sumer was a country continually being created beneath the feet of its people. The ground was young, soft, and changeable. Stone was rare. Timber was limited. Metal had to be brought from far away. The people built with what the land gave them most generously: clay and reeds. From reeds came mats, baskets, boats, fences, roofs, and the light architecture of the marsh. From clay came bricks, pottery, ceilings, tablets, figurines, and the bodies of temples. Mud was not a poor material in this world. It was the substance of civilization. Mixed, pressed, dried, stacked, and repaired, it became houses, walls, platforms, ovens, drains, and archives. Even writing began in clay, with signs pressed into a surface that could be dried into memory. This landscape also shaped imagination. In a land where dry ground rose from water, creation itself could be pictured as emergence. Order appeared as a clearing made against surrounding chaos. The temple platform rising above the settlement resembled a sacred height in a country without mountains. The city wall marked a boundary between cultivated safety and the threatening open spaces beyond. The canal cut a line of intention through wilderness. Human work did not merely decorate the world. It rescued a portion of it from uncertainty. To the south lay marshlands, dense and mysterious, a region of reeds, islands, birds, fish, buffalo-like movement, and hidden waterways. These wetlands were not empty margins. They were rich zones of food and material, places where boats moved through narrow passages and where communities lived with 1 foot on earth and 1 foot in water. The marshes held their own rhythms, their own dangers, their own ancient knowledge. They offered fish, fowl, reeds, and grazing, but they also blurred boundaries. Land and water mingled there, and so did settlement and wildness. To the north and east, trade routes connected the plain to worlds it could not supply from within itself. Since southern Mesopotamia lacked many raw materials, its cities became hungry for exchange. Stone, timber, metals, and precious materials traveled inward: grain, textiles, crafted goods, and perhaps ideas moved outward. The very poverty of local resources may have encouraged outward vision. Sumer was rooted in mud, yet its economy reached toward mountains, deserts, and distant coasts, archaeology reveals this wider web slowly and patiently. Stratigraphic excavation exposes layers of occupation where changes in pottery, architecture, and burial custom can be traced. Lithic analysis helps identify stone tools and the distant sources of materials not native to the alluvial plain. Archaeobotanical study examines seeds, grains, date stones, and plant remains, allowing scholars to reconstruct fields, diets, and environmental pressure. Radiocarbon dating places organic traces within a measured chronology. Environmental cores drawn from ancient river channels and marsh deposits give glimpses of flood histories, salinity, vegetation, and climate change. Through such evidence, the land becomes readable. The rise of Sumer was not a miracle floating outside nature. It was a human response to nature at its most challenging. Agriculture here required discipline. Herding required movement. Fishing required intimate knowledge of channels and seasons. Building required constant repair, because mud brick returned to mud if neglected. Nothing stayed complete forever. Walls slumped, canals silted, fields salted, roofs decayed. Every year demanded renewal. Perhaps this is one reason the Sumerians imagined the universe as a system requiring service. The gods had to be fed. Temples had to be maintained. Canals had to be cleared. The dead had to be remembered. Kings had to prove themselves through building and restoration. Order was not permanent. It was an achievement repeated again and again. The rivers taught this lesson in their own language. They could bless a city with fertility and then threaten it with flood. They could carry boats full of grain and then abandon a channel on which a settlement depended. They could connect communities or divide them. In the flatness of Sumer, power followed water. Whoever managed canals managed food. Whoever managed food managed labor. Whoever commanded labor could raise temples, walls, armies, and monuments. So the first cities did not rise simply because the land was fertile. Fertility alone is too gentle a word. They rose because the land was fertile and dangerous, generous and unstable, abundant and exacting. The Sumerian plain gave life, but only to those who answered it with organization, memory, and collective will. At dawn, one might imagine the ancient fields shining with irrigation water, the low sun turning every channel to bronze. Men and women moved along the banks with baskets, tools, and animals. Children watched sheep passing through dust. Fishermen pushed reed boats into the marsh. Smoke lifted from ovens. Somewhere, a temple official counted grain. Somewhere, a scribe pressed signs into clay. Somewhere beyond the cultivated edge, the desert waited, dry and immense. This was the cradle, but not a cradle of softness. It was a cradle of heat, labor, silt, salt, flood, and prayer. And from that restless ground, humanity learned how to build cities. At first, the cities of Sumer appear as mounds, low, weathered, wind-bitten rises on a flat plain. From a distance, they seem natural, as if the earth has merely folded itself into gentle, swelling forms. But beneath those rises lie the bones of streets, courtyards, thresholds, ovens, drains, workshops, sanctuaries, and walls. Beneath them lie the packed lives of generations. Each mound is not one city, but many cities stacked in silence, one rebuilding over the ruins of another. Mud brick melting into mud brick, memory compressed into earth. Uruk was among the greatest of them. In its age of power, Uruk was not simply large, it was astonishing. It gathered people into a density almost unknown before in human history. Its precincts rose with temple platforms, administrative buildings, courts, and sacred spaces. Its walls, later remembered in heroic tradition, seemed to announce that the city had become more than a place to live. It had become an idea, a boundary, a statement made in brick. Imagine approaching Uruk across the plain at sunset. The fields lie behind canals, green against the dun-colored earth. Herds move through dust. Workers return from the outskirts. Ahead, the city rises low and broad, its buildings catching the last light. The smell of animals, grain, smoke, river mud, and human closeness gathers in the air. At the gates, traffic thickens. Donkeys carry loads. Potters bring vessels. Fishermen bring baskets wet from the marsh. Officials watch. Children slip between adults. Somewhere within the sacred quarter, a ritual has begun. The city breathes. A Sumerian city was not a modern city. It was not divided neatly into private life, government, economy, and religion. as though these were separate rooms in the house of civilization. In Sumer, the temple touched everything. The palace, when it rose in strength, did not erase the temple, but entered into a powerful and uneasy conversation with it. The fields beyond the walls fed the inner courts. The canals linked households to storehouses. The workshops answered to patrons. The gods stood at the center, and around them human life revolved. Eridu, further south, carried a different kind of memory. Later tradition looked upon it as a place of deep beginnings, a city associated with wisdom and sacred waters. Archaeology shows long sequences of occupation, including temple rebuilding over many centuries. Each new sacred structure rose upon the remains of an older one, as though holiness accumulated vertically, layer upon layer. The act of rebuilding was not merely practical. It was a declaration that the divine presence remained, that the old foundation still mattered, that the city's identity was rooted in a past already ancient to its own inhabitants. Near the waterways that opened toward the Gulf, became famous for wealth, royal tombs, trade, and monumental architecture. Its later ziggurat, massive and solemn, still suggests the kind of ambition that animated these cities. Yet was not only royal splendor. It was also streets where neighbors knew one another's debts, courtyards where families cooked and argued, rooms where wool was worked, spaces where merchants calculated risk, and graves where the dead were placed with objects meant to accompany them beyond sight. Lagash, with its rivalries and records, reveals another face of Sumer, the city as political organism. It had boundaries, temples, rulers, workers, dependent laborers, scribes, soldiers, and disputes with neighboring powers. Its inscriptions speak of conflict, reform, justice, building, and divine favor. Here we see the city-state as a living creature, proud and anxious, always guarding fields, canals, rights, and prestige. Nippur was different again. It was a sacred heart, a city of immense religious importance, especially connected with the great god of authority and cosmic order. Even when kings ruled elsewhere, they desired legitimacy from Nippur, to control it, honor it, restore it, or be recognized by its priesthood was to stand closer to the center of the world. Nippur reminds us that power in Sumer was not only measured in weapons and walls, it was measured in sacred recognition. These cities were separate, rival, and often fiercely independent. They shared language, religious patterns, artistic habits, and material culture. Yet each possessed its own identity. Each had its patron deity. Each had its traditions. Each looked upon its territory as precious, bounded, and divinely meaningful. The result was a landscape of urban stars, shining near one another, sometimes trading, sometimes marrying, sometimes worshiping similar gods, and sometimes meeting in violence beneath banners carried into battle. What did one of these cities look like from within? The streets were likely narrow, irregular, and alive with movement. Houses were built of mud brick, often arranged around inner courtyards that gave light and air. Outer walls might appear plain, almost secretive, while the interior held the true household world. There were storage rooms, sleeping areas, workspaces, cooking installations, and family shrines. Roofs could serve as spaces for labor, rest, drying goods, and watching the city under the night sky. Drainage mattered. Water had to be managed not only in fields but in neighborhoods. Waste, runoff, and household needs required channels, pits, and maintenance. The city was a technical achievement as much as a sacred one. Its survival depended on countless small acts of repair: patching a wall, clearing a drain, replacing reeds, replastering a surface, rebuilding a threshold after rain or flood. Workshops filled the urban body with specialized skill. Potters shaped vessels for storage, cooking, offering, and trade. Weavers turned wool into textiles, among the great products of Mesopotamian economies. Metalworkers handled materials brought from distant regions. Reed workers, leather workers, carpenters, brewers, bakers, boatmen, herders, gardeners, and scribes all formed part of the city's living machinery. Specialization did not mean ease. It meant dependence. The potter needed fuel and clay. The weaver needed wool. The temple needed offerings. The field worker needed water. The scribe needed training, patronage, and access to institutions. A city is a promise that strangers can live together. That promise is fragile. It requires rules. It requires measures. It requires punishments, rituals, shared stories, and accepted hierarchies. In Sumer, One can feel this promise being tested for the first time at a grand scale. People who were not kin lived near one another. Grain moved from field to storehouse. Labor was summoned for public projects. Goods were counted and redistributed. Disputes had to be settled by something larger than personal revenge. The city created new possibilities, but also new tensions. This is the hidden drama of Sumerian urban life. The city protected people, fed them, employed them, and gave them access to gods whose houses stood at the center. But it also watched them, measured them, taxed them, summoned them, and ranked them. Civilization brought beauty, music, writing, law, and monumental architecture. It also brought bureaucracy, inequality, debt, forced labor, and war. The first cities carried both gifts and shadows. The temple precincts made this contradiction visible. They were places of awe, rising above ordinary life, filled with ritual, music, incense, offerings, polished vessels, statues, and sacred order. Yet they were also administrative engines. Behind the solemn ceremonies stood storage rooms, labor accounts, herds, fields, and managers. The divine household was a real household, with real needs, real servants, and real economic force. To walk through Sumer's cities is to lose oneself among the myriad altars of the past. Here, the sacred and the practical are inseparable. A bowl is not only a bowl if it carries an offering. A field is not only a field if its harvest belongs to a god. A king is not only a ruler if his authority is imagined as granted from heaven. A wall is not only defense if it marks the ordered realm of a divine city against the uncertain world beyond. Still, beneath all the ceremony, there were human beings, a woman grinding grain before dawn, a child learning signs on a clay tablet, a laborer standing knee-deep in canal mud, a brewer watching foam rise, a soldier oiling a spear, a priest washing before entering a sanctuary, a merchant worrying over silver, a mother mourning an infant, an old man sitting near a doorway while evening cools the street. Their cities were made from mud, but their ambitions were immense. They built upward toward the gods and outward across the plain. They made places where memory could accumulate, where institutions could endure beyond one lifetime, where the dead remained underfoot and the living carried on above them. The first cities were not accidents. They were deliberate acts of imagination against chaos. In the beginning, writing did not sing. It counted long before poetry found its way into clay, long before kings carved their pride into stone, long before hymns carried the names of gods through centuries of darkness. The first signs were born from need. Grain had to be measured. Sheep had to be counted. Workers had to be assigned rations, jars of oil, bundles of reeds, baskets of dates, and lengths of wool had to be remembered beyond the reach of a single human mind. Memory was no longer enough. A village can remember by face and voice. A household can remember by habit. But a city is too vast for memory alone. When fields stretch beyond sight, when storehouses fill and empty, when laborers arrive in groups, when offerings must be delivered at appointed times, when property passes from one hand to another, some new power is required. In Sumer, that power emerged from clay. The first marks were practical, almost severe in their simplicity. They stood close to objects, numbers, and transactions. A wedge, a line, a sign for barley, a sign for a jar, a sign for a head of livestock. These marks did not begin as a complete mirror of spoken language. They were tools of administration, born in the world of storage rooms and temple accounts. Yet, hidden inside that practical invention was a revolution so vast that its makers could scarcely have imagined its final reach. The reed stylus was the instrument, cut from the wetlands and pressed into soft clay. It left impressions shaped like tiny wedges. The hand that held it did not carve like a sculptor or paint like an artist. It pressed, turned, angled, and lifted. Each movement required discipline. Each sign had a form. Each form carried meaning. Wet clay received the mark, and once dried, the mark could outlive the voice that ordered it. This was the awakening of cuneiform. At first, one can imagine a room filled not with mystery, but with labor. Clay prepared and flattened, tablets shaped in the palm, a supervisor speaking, goods being brought in, quantities checked, a scribe bending close, reed in hand, recording the flow of things through the institution. Outside, carts creak, animals complain, Workers wait for rations. Inside, the tablet grows crowded with signs. To us, such documents may seem plain, but they are among the most extraordinary objects ever made by human beings. They show that the world had become recordable. A debt could be fixed. A delivery could be proven. A name could be preserved. An obligation could survive the moment of speech. Power could now travel through symbols. Writing changed authority. A spoken command depends upon presence. A written command can move away from its speaker. It can enter a storeroom, a court, a distant field, or a later generation. It can be checked, copied, disputed, archived, and used again. The tablet made institutions stronger because it gave them memory beyond flesh. It allowed a temple or palace to act almost like a person who never forgot. But writing also created a new class of specialists. The scribe stood between sound and sign, between speech and institution. To become a scribe was not simple. Children trained in tablet houses, copying signs again and again, learning lists, measures, formulas, names of professions, names of objects, names of gods, names of cities. Their exercises survive in clay, sometimes clumsy, sometimes elegant, still bearing the pressure of young hands. One can almost hear the teacher correcting posture, order, and sign shape. One can almost feel the student's frustration as wet clay records both obedience and error. The tablet house was not merely a school. It was a gate into power. Those who mastered writing could serve temples, palaces, merchants, and courts. They could record contracts, manage land, calculate rations, preserve hymns, and copy ancient compositions. They became custodians of precision in a world increasingly ruled by measurement. They did not simply write civilization down. They helped civilization become what it was. As signs developed, they moved from pictures toward abstraction. The system grew capable of representing sounds, grammar, names, and complex expressions. What had begun as accounting became language. What had begun as memory aid became literature. The clay that once recorded barley could now preserve grief, praise, law, myth, argument, and wonder. Here, the transformation becomes almost sacred. A people who first pressed signs into mud to count goods eventually used the same medium to ask why human beings exist, why cities fall, why gods become angry, why kings die, and whether life can escape the grave. Administrative necessity opened a door into philosophical depth. The storehouse became, unexpectedly, the ancestor of the library. The Sumerian language itself presents a strange and haunting case. It is a language isolate, with no known close relative securely identified. Its survival in written form depended upon the scribal tradition. Later peoples continued to copy and study it long after it ceased to be spoken in daily life. In this way, Sumerian became both a language of origin and a language of learning, preserved like a sacred relic inside the machinery of later Mesopotamian culture. Writing also changed time. Without writing, the past lives in memory, song, ritual, and monument. With writing, the past acquires another body. It can be stored in archives. It can be compared. It can contradict. It can speak in the words of the dead. The tablet is small enough to hold in the hand, yet it opens a corridor across millennia. When a modern reader sees a list of rations or a hymn to a goddess, the distance between worlds narrows for a moment. A human act becomes visible across an abyss of time. Still, the birth of writing was not a simple triumph. To record is also to control. To count workers is to manage them. To list fields is to claim them. To measure grain is to distribute it, withhold it, tax it, or dedicate it. Writing could protect rights, but it could also harden hierarchy. It could preserve justice, but it could also serve authority. On clay, the earliest civilization wrote both its brilliance and its burdens. The tablet did not care whether it recorded abundance or suffering. It received everything with the same quiet surface. A ration list for laborers, a legal dispute over property, a hymn glowing with divine praise, a lament for a ruined city, a proverb about foolishness, a school exercise, a royal inscription proclaiming victory, a myth in which gods shape humanity from clay so that the work of the universe may continue. All of it entered the archive. And perhaps this is why Sumer still feels so near. Its monuments are broken. Its temples are eroded. Its canals are lost or shifted. Its kings are dust. Yet its thoughts remain in marks made by a reed. The fragile material proved stronger than memory. Clay, of all things, carried the first great burden of human consciousness into the future. Imagine a scribe at dusk, seated in a room where the day's heat still clings to the walls. The tablet is damp in his hand. Outside, the city settles into evening. Animals are led through narrow streets. Smoke rises from household fires. Voices soften. In the temple court, preparations continue beneath the watching statue of a god. The scribe presses the final signs. Perhaps he records grain. Perhaps a name. Perhaps a line of praise. Perhaps he does not know that. Thousands of years away, strangers will search those marks for the beginning of history. He sets the tablet aside to dry. The clay holds, the voice remains. In Sumer, the gods did not live beyond the world. They lived inside it. They stood in the storm that rolled across the plain, in the river that rose without warning, in the grain that swelled from black soil, in the star that appeared at its appointed hour, in the terror of illness, in the cry of childbirth, in the silence of death, and in the strange order by which a city continued to exist at all. The gods were not distant decorations placed above human life. They were its owners, its judges, its architects, and its invisible rulers. Every major city belonged to a divine power. The city was a household, and the god was its master. The temple was not merely symbolic. It was the god's dwelling, a real house with doors, courts, storerooms, kitchens, attendants, musicians, craftsmen, priests, servants, fields, herds, boats, and accounts. The divine image inside the sanctuary was treated not as an empty object, but as the embodied presence of the deity. It was washed, clothed, fed, adorned, praised, and guarded. Meals were prepared for it. Songs were offered before it. Festivals carried it into the sight of the people. To enter such a world, one must set aside the modern habit of separating belief from administration, prayer from economics, and ritual from politics. In Sumer, these streams flowed together like channels in a great irrigation system. The god required service, and service required labor. The god required offerings, and offerings required fields. The god required a temple, and temples required builders, brickmakers, reed cutters, carpenters, metalworkers, weavers, brewers, bakers, scribes, and overseers. Religion did not hover above civilization. It pulled civilization into shape. This is one of the most powerful reversals offered by the Sumerian evidence. The older imagination often pictures early cities as practical machines that later clothed themselves in myth. First came farming, then surplus, then temples, then gods made grand by wealthy rulers. But the evidence resists so simple a march. In the earliest urban centers, sacred architecture and collective labor appear at the very core of the social order. The temple was not an ornament added to the city. The temple was one of the reasons the city could exist. Here, gods built civilization by being needed. A god needed a house worthy of divine presence. A house needed workers. Workers needed rations. Rations required grain. Grain required canals. Canals required coordination. Coordination required authority. Authority required legitimacy. Legitimacy came from the gods. Around and around the circle turned, each part strengthening the other, until human labor and divine service became almost impossible to distinguish. The Sumerian pantheon was vast, complex, and full of personality. There were gods of sky, storm, wisdom, love, fertility, war, fresh water, the underworld, writing, grain, justice, and the terrifying forces that governed fate. They formed families, rivalries, councils, and hierarchies. They could be generous, but they were not tame. They could bless a city, abandon it, punish it, or demand from it a loyalty deeper than comfort. Their emotions were immense. Their decisions shaped worlds. The gods were not always morally simple. They argued, they desired, they plotted, they made mistakes. They could show mercy, but also fury. In this, Sumerian religion reveals a profound realism. The universe itself seemed unstable, powerful, fertile, and dangerous. Why should its divine rulers be less so? A river that feeds a field can also drown a child. A storm that clears the air can flatten a house. A king who protects can also oppress. The gods carried the grandeur and dread of the forces they governed. The people served them not only out of fear, but out of dependence. To feed the gods was to maintain order. To sing to them was to keep relationship alive. To rebuild their temples was to renew the bond between heaven and earth. Ritual was not theater in the shallow sense. It was maintenance of reality. The world did not run automatically. It needed attention. It needed words spoken properly, offerings given correctly, purity observed, festivals enacted, omens read, and offenses repaired. The temple staff formed a world within the world. Priests performed sacred duties. Lamentation singers gave voice to grief and supplication. Musicians filled courts with sound. Diviners sought meaning in signs. Scribes recorded offerings, personnel, animals, land, and goods. Women served in various temple roles, some attached to weaving, food production, ritual, or elite religious office. The temple was a sacred organism with many hands. One might imagine a morning in a great sanctuary. Before the city fully wakes, water is drawn, floors are swept, incense begins to thicken the air, bread is prepared, beer is poured, fine garments are brought out. The divine statue waits in the dimness, hidden from ordinary sight, shining with metal, cloth, and stone. Outside, the city stirs toward labor. Inside, the god is served as a sovereign. This service shaped politics. A ruler could not merely say, "I am strong." He had to say, "The god has chosen me." He had to build, restore, protect, and offer. His inscriptions praise divine command more than personal independence. He presents himself as shepherd, servant, steward, builder, and warrior on behalf of the gods. Even conquest could be described as the execution of divine will. Even justice could be proclaimed as a sacred duty. Such claims were not empty words. They were the language through which power became acceptable. A ruler who restored a temple entered cosmic memory. A king who neglected divine obligations risked disaster in both political and theological terms. If famine came, if invasion succeeded, if flood destroyed the fields, people could ask not only what had failed in administration, but what had gone wrong between the city and its gods. The gods also gave meaning to labor. For the Sumerians, work was not only economic necessity, it was woven into the structure of creation. Fields were plowed because gods required offerings and humans required bread. Canals were dug because cultivated order had to be defended against waste and wildness. Bricks were molded because divine houses must stand. Songs were sung because praise was part of the world's proper rhythm. The burden of labor could be heavy, but it belonged within a cosmic arrangement. And yet, there is unease beneath the beauty. If humans serve the gods, then what is human freedom? If kings rule by divine favor, who can challenge them? If temples own fields and command labor, where does devotion end and control begin? The Sumerian texts do not erase these tensions. They preserve a world in which splendor and burden stand together. The god's house feeds the city, but also consumes its effort. The sacred center gives identity, but also demands submission. The divine order protects, but it ranks all things. This is why Sumer remains so haunting. Its religion was not an escape from reality. It was reality intensified. The people looked at the world as it was, fertile and cruel, ordered and unpredictable, and they saw divine powers moving through it. They did not imagine themselves alone beneath empty skies. They lived watched, commanded, tested, and sometimes cherished. In the long evening of the ancient plain, as temple lamps flickered and the smoke of offerings drifted upward, one can feel the emotional force of that vision. A city existed because its God remained. A people endured because the sacred order still held. Every brick, every ration, every hymn, every field, every festival became part of a vast conversation between mortals and powers older than memory. The gods of Sumer did not merely receive civilization, they demanded it into being. The oldest creation stories of Sumer do not open with comfort. They open with work, not gentle work, not work as noble self-expression, not the peaceful labor of a garden beneath a forgiving sky, but heavy work, ancient work, cosmic work. Before mankind appears, the divine world itself is burdened. Canals must be dug, fields must be tended, order must be maintained. The universe is not imagined as effortless. Even the gods know strain. This is the unsettling heart of the Sumerian vision. Humanity is not created because the cosmos lacks beauty. Humanity is not created because the gods are lonely in a sentimental heaven. Humanity is created because labor must be done. The earth must be worked. The food of the gods must be prepared. The sacred houses must be supplied. The canals must carry water through the land. The burden once resting upon divine shoulders is transferred to mortal hands. In these stories, human beings are shaped from clay. The image is simple, but immense. Clay was everywhere in the southern plain. It clung to feet after floodwater withdrew. It formed bricks in the sun. It received the reed stylus. It made bowls, jars, walls, hearths, figurines, tablets, and tombs. To say that humans were made from clay was not to call them worthless. It was to place them within the most useful substance of the Sumerian world, the material from which civilization itself could be formed. Clay is humble, but clay remembers. Pressed by fingers, it keeps the shape. Baked by heat, it hardens. Left alone, it cracks. Mixed with water, it becomes workable again. In the image of humans shaped from clay, there is tenderness and terror at once. We are formed, useful, fragile, temporary, and marked by forces greater than ourselves. Some Mesopotamian traditions speak of clay mixed with divine blood or divine essence. In such imagery, humanity is both low and high, mud and mystery together. The mortal body belongs to the earth, yet some spark of the sacred enters it. This is not a simple celebration of human greatness. It is a complicated burden. If people contain something of the divine, then their service is not meaningless. But if they were made for service, then their greatness is bound to obligation. This is the forbidden story because it refuses flattery. Modern people often prefer origin stories that place humanity at the summit, standing proudly as the purpose of all things. The Sumerian texts offer a colder grandeur. They imagine human beings as necessary servants in a divine economy. People exist so that the gods may rest, so that temples may function, so that offerings may rise, so that the world may continue in its appointed pattern. The first breath of mankind in this vision is tied to duty, and yet one must listen carefully. Duty does not mean emptiness. In Sumer, service could be sacred. To provide for the gods was to participate in cosmic order, to plant, harvest, bake, brew, build, sing, and record was not merely to survive. It was to hold back chaos. A canal cleared of silt was a victory over disorder. A temple meal prepared correctly was an act of alignment between heaven and earth. A hymn sung at the proper time renewed the relationship between mortal city and divine ruler. Still, the shadow remains. If humans were made to carry work, then suffering is not an accident at the edge of existence. It is built into the arrangement, the aching back of the laborer, the tired eyes of the scribe, the cracked hands of the brickmaker, the woman grinding grain in the half-light before dawn, the field worker standing in mud beneath a burning sun. All belong to the same ancient explanation. Life is labor because mankind was born from labor's demand. Such a story could comfort those who suffered by giving hardship cosmic meaning. It could also justify the demands placed upon them. This double edge runs through the Sumerian imagination like a dark river. Religion dignifies work. Religion commands work. Religion explains hierarchy. Religion binds the humble to the eternal. Creation myths are never only about the beginning. They are maps of society. A people's account of human origin tells us what they think a human being is. In Sumer, a human being is not an isolated individual wandering through a private universe. A human being belongs to a network of obligations to gods, household, city, ruler, field, ancestors, and future descendants. The self is not alone. It is placed. It is named. It is watched. It is needed. The myths of creation also carry memories of environment. The shaping of humanity from clay reflects a world where mud was the raw material of life. The emphasis on canals reflects a civilization where water management determined survival. The divine need for food reflects temple economies in which offerings, storage, and redistribution structured daily existence. The myth is not separate from the field. It rises from it. One can imagine a scribe copying such a story in a dim schoolroom, the tablet damp beneath his palm. Around him, younger students repeat signs. Outside, the city makes the meaning of the myth visible. Workers haul baskets of earth. Donkeys bray beneath loads. Women carry jars. Temple officials check deliveries. Bakers prepare loaves. Brewers watch vats. The creation of mankind is not distant theology. It is being enacted in the streets. The myth says this is why you work, not because kings merely command it, not because hunger alone drives it, not because the world is kind. You work because humanity was made into the living instrument by which divine order continues. There is something magnificent in that idea, and something almost unbearable. For the Sumerians, the gods were powerful, but not abstract perfection. They had needs. They desired rest, praise, food, music, houses, and honor. The human world met those needs through organized labor. Civilization therefore became a sacred exchange. Mortals served the gods. The gods, when properly honored, allowed fertility, kingship, protection, and order to endure. When the exchange broke, disaster threatened. This was not a childish explanation. It was a profound reflection on dependence. The Sumerians knew that no city sustains itself without ceaseless effort. They knew that stored grain does not appear by magic, that canals do not clear themselves, that walls do not remain standing, that gods do not remain honored unless human beings remember them. Their creation stories took this social truth and projected it onto the universe. Humanity was created because maintenance is the condition of existence, and perhaps that is why the story still unsettles the modern mind. It strips away the dream that civilization is natural, easy, or inevitable. It shows a world in which order must be made and remade by hands that tire. It reminds us that beneath every monument lies labor, beneath every sacred song lies grain, beneath every archive lies a worker preparing clay, beneath every city lies a bargain with necessity. In the deep imagination of Sumer, mankind rises from mud, not as a king over creation, but as a servant within it. Yet the servant writes, the servant builds, the servant remembers. The servant raises temples whose ruins outlast empires. The servant presses words into clay, and those words cross thousands of years to trouble the sleep of distant ages. So the forbidden story is not only that humans were made to work, it is that through work, humans became unforgettable. In the Sumerian imagination, kingship did not begin as an invention of men. It descended. That single idea changes everything. Rule was not presented as a convenience, a bargain, or a temporary arrangement among families who needed order. Kingship came down from heaven. It entered the human world as a sacred force, a gift and a burden, a blazing authority placed among cities so that mortal life might be organized beneath divine command. This vision survives most famously in the Sumerian king list, one of the strangest political documents ever produced by the ancient world. At first glance, it appears to be a record of rulers and cities. Names follow names. Reigns follow reigns. Kingship passes from one city to another. But the deeper one reads, the more ordinary history dissolves into something vaster and more troubling. Some of the earliest kings are said to have ruled for thousands, even tens of thousands of years. Then comes a great flood. Then kingship descends again. The list is not history in the modern sense. It is history braided with theology, memory, propaganda, and cosmic order. For the people who preserved it, the question was not merely who ruled, but why rule existed at all. The king list gives an answer in the language of sacred origin. Authority belongs first to heaven. Human kings do not create legitimacy from nothing. They receive it, hold it for a time, lose it, and watch it pass elsewhere. A city may shine under divine favor, then fall silent when that favor moves. The earliest portion of the list is especially haunting. Before the flood, kings rule for impossible spans. Their reigns stretch across ages that no human life could contain. To the modern mind, these numbers may seem like fantasy, exaggeration, or symbolic mathematics. Yet their impossibility is part of their power. They tell us that early kingship was imagined as more than administrative leadership. It belonged to a different quality of time. A primeval age when God stood nearer, when the world was larger, when memory itself had not yet narrowed into ordinary chronology. These antediluvian rulers stand like shadows at the edge of written history. Their names are not merely personal names. They are markers of a world before catastrophe. They belong to the deep past, where myth and memory join hands. The flood does not simply interrupt the list. It divides reality. Before it, reigns are vast and almost dreamlike. After it, time becomes more recognizably human, though still grand, still sacred, still full of royal claims and divine movement. A king in Sumer was never only a strong man with soldiers. He was a mediator, He stood between city and God, between temple and field, between war and order, between the fragile human settlement and the dangerous world pressing at its edges. He built walls. He restored sanctuaries. He dug canals. He judged disputes. He led armies. He offered gifts. He spoke of justice. He claimed that his rule brought proper order to the land. Royal inscriptions reveal this carefully shaped image. The ruler presents himself as chosen by a god, beloved of a goddess, shepherd of the people, builder of temples, protector of boundaries, destroyer of enemies, and restorer of ancient foundations. These claims were not casual boasting. They formed the language through which kingship explained itself. A king had to be more than victorious. He had to be necessary. Yet the Sumerian city-state was not a simple kingdom in the later imperial sense. Political power could take different forms. Some cities had rulers whose titles and roles changed across time. Assemblies, elders, temple institutions, elite households, and military leaders all may have played parts in public decision-making at different stages. Kingship grew within this complex environment, not above it in sudden isolation. The rise of stronger kings may reflect the pressures of the world around them. Fields had to be defended. Canals had to be managed. Boundaries had to be fixed. Labor had to be mobilized. Rival cities competed for land, water, trade routes, and divine prestige. In such a world, the figure who could command workers, direct defense, lead in war, and speak in the name of the gods became increasingly powerful. Crisis makes authority attractive. War sharpens hierarchy. Monumental building gives power a visible body. The king became the human face of organized force. But the Sumerian king list does something even more ambitious. It imagines kingship as a single institution moving from city to city. Eridu, Bad Tibira, Larak, Sippar, Shuruppak, then the flood. Later, Kish, Uruk, Ur, Awan, and others receive the royal power in turn. This creates a grand pattern where political supremacy is not random. It is transferable, ordained, and meaningful. When one city rises, it does not merely defeat another. It receives the destiny that heaven has allowed. This was political theology of the highest order. For a king or dynasty, to be placed within such a pattern was to gain dignity beyond local ambition. A ruler could claim participation in the cosmic history of kingship itself. His city became not just a city, but the latest vessel of heavenly authority. The list could unify a fractured political landscape in imagination. Even when real cities remained rivals on the ground, there's beauty in this vision, but also danger. If kingship descends from heaven, then resistance can appear as rebellion against cosmic order. If a ruler claims divine choice, his violence may be dressed as sacred duty. The language that gives meaning to justice can also sanctify domination. Sumerian kingship, like all sacred power, carried both radiance and shadow. The people knew that kings could fail. Laments speak of cities abandoned, temples destroyed, gods departing, and rulers unable to save their people. The divine gift of kingship did not guarantee permanent success. Heaven could grant, and heaven could withdraw. A king was powerful, but not secure. His reign depended on forces beyond his control flood: drought, rebellion, invasion, disease, divine anger, and the grinding unpredictability of human affairs. This made kingship deeply dramatic. The king stood high, but the height was exposed. He wore authority, but authority had a source beyond him. He commanded labor, but needed blessing. He judged others, but was judged by gods in memory. He raised monuments in mud, brick, and stone, knowing that rival kings might destroy them or claim them. He sent his name into inscriptions because the future was uncertain. The impossible reigns of the early kings may also express a longing for order before decay. In a world where cities rose and fell, where canals silted and wars broke boundaries, a ruler who reigned for ages represented stability beyond ordinary human reach. The numbers are not merely exaggerations. They are dreams of duration. They say that once, in the beginning, power was vast, time was wide, and kingship stood closer to the divine. But the flood comes. The flood always comes. It sweeps across the list like a wound in memory. It marks the end of one age and the beginning of another. Kingship must descend again because the world has been broken and remade. In this movement, Sumerian thought joins politics to catastrophe. Authority is not only founded once, it must be restored after destruction. The city must rise again from mud. The king must appear again beneath heaven. The fragile order must be rebuilt. Imagine a scribe copying the king list by lamplight. His reed moves over clay, writing names older than certainty. He does not simply record rulers. He arranges time. He gives the chaos of competing cities a sacred sequence. He binds local memory into cosmic history. Each name becomes a stepping stone across the abyss. For modern readers, the Sumerian king list remains answerless, adrift to ponder. It frustrates the historian who seeks clean chronology. It seduces the dreamer who sees in it echoes of forgotten ages. It challenges everyone because it refuses to belong entirely to myth or history. It is both. It is a royal mirror held up to the ancient mind. The kings of Sumer were mortal, but kingship was imagined as more than mortal. It came down from heaven, settled upon cities, survived disaster, passed through conquest, and gave human power a sacred grammar. In that grammar, the ruler became shepherd, builder, warrior, servant, judge, and chosen instrument. His body would die. His city might fall. His inscription might break. Yet the idea of kingship would continue, descending again and again into the restless world of men. The flood is one of humanity's oldest fears. Not rain alone, not a swollen river alone, not the ordinary rising of water against a bank, but the terrible vision of a world drowned. Fields vanish first, then roads, then thresholds, then the lower walls of houses. Animals cry from roofs and mounds. Boats break loose from their moorings. Grain stores soften and collapse. The dead are disturbed beneath the earth. The line between land and river disappears, and with it disappears the human confidence that the world is stable. In the texts of ancient Sumer, the flood is not only weather, it is judgment, it is rupture, it is the end of an age. Among the most haunting figures connected with this tradition is the flood survivor, a man remembered in different Mesopotamian languages and versions under different names, yet always bearing the same unbearable role. He is the one warned before destruction. He is the one who preserves life. He is the one who looks out upon a ruined world after the waters have done their work. He becomes the memory keeper of catastrophe. The Sumerian flood tradition survives in fragmentary form, broken like the tablets that carried it. Yet even in its damaged state, it offers a vision of extraordinary power. There is a divine decision. There is impending destruction. There is warning. There is a boat. There is survival. There is the re-establishment of life after devastation. The story stands like a pillar in the deep architecture of Near Eastern memory. The great question is not whether floods happened. They did. The question is how floods became myth. Southern Mesopotamia was a land where water could create and destroy with the same hand. The rivers carried fertility, but they also carried violence. Unlike the predictable inundations celebrated along the Nile, the floods of Mesopotamia could be sudden, destructive, and uneven. A city might flourish near a channel for generations, then suffer disaster when waters rose, embankments failed, or river courses shifted. The flatness of the land increased the terror. Once water escaped control, it could spread widely, swallowing field boundaries, houses, shrines, and graves. Archaeology has revealed flood deposits at certain Mesopotamian sites, layers of silt interrupting occupation levels. Some early excavators hoped such deposits might prove a single universal flood. The evidence is more complicated, and therefore more interesting. Flood layers are local, varied, and not always from the same period. One site's catastrophe may have been another site's rumor. One city's ruin may have become another city's inherited warning. Over time, memories of many floods may have gathered into one great flood of story. This is how landscapes become theology. A community survives a terrible inundation. Elders remember where the water reached. Parents tell children how animals were lost, how grain was ruined, how a shrine collapsed, how one family escaped by boat, how bodies were found in reeds. Generations pass. The story grows. It becomes attached to divine anger, human failure, royal memory, and cosmic renewal. A local disaster becomes a universal pattern. The flood becomes not just something that happened, but something that reveals what the world is. The Mesopotamian flood is especially profound because it does not merely destroy wickedness in a simple moral tale. In some versions, the motives of the gods are complex, even troubling. Humans may be too numerous, too noisy, too disruptive, The divine assembly may decide destruction for reasons that do not satisfy modern expectations of justice. This gives the story a darker texture. It reflects a universe where human survival depends on powers that are not always transparent, not always gentle, not always explainable. The flood survivor does not conquer the waters. He is spared. This distinction matters. He survives not through heroic strength, but through warning, obedience, craft, and favor. He builds because he is told to build. He preserves life because knowledge arrives before disaster. His wisdom lies in listening. In a land where survival depended upon reading signs, water levels, seasons, omens, commands, and records. This was no small virtue. Imagine the building of the boat in the shadow of disbelief. Timber gathered from afar, reeds bundled, bitumen prepared to seal the seams, ropes tightened, compartments made ready. The air smells of pitch, river mud, sweat, and fear. Those who watch may laugh, question, or whisper. The sky remains clear for a time. The ordinary world continues. Bread is baked, fields are worked, children play. The warning belongs to the future, and the future is always difficult to believe. Then the weather changes. Clouds gather over the plain. Winds move. The first rain darkens the dust. Channels rise. Banks weaken. The rivers roar louder in the night. Livestock are driven toward higher ground. If higher ground can be found, people climb. People call out. Doors break. Walls soften. The city made of mud meets the full power of water. And mud remembers that it was never stone. In the mythic imagination, the flood overwhelms not only people but order itself. The city, that great human answer to chaos, is undone by a chaos older than walls. The temple courtyard fills. The street becomes a channel. The boundary stone vanishes. The field cannot be distinguished from the river. Names, ranks, debts, laws, and possessions lose their meaning beneath the same brown surface. This is why the flood story endured. It told the truth that civilization, however magnificent, is fragile. The flood traditions of Mesopotamia later echoed through other cultures and sacred literatures. Similar patterns appeared in stories far beyond Sumer's first clay records: a divine warning, a chosen survivor, a vessel, preserved animals, a mountain or landing place, sacrifice after survival, and a changed relationship between humans and the divine. These echoes do not reduce the stories to copies. They reveal a long corridor of memory where catastrophe was retold in new languages, shaped by new faiths, and given new moral meanings. But the Sumerian and Mesopotamian versions preserve something stark and ancient at the root. The flood is not only punishment, it is interruption. It is the breaking of time. It divides an older world from a newer one. It explains why kingship must begin again, why cities must be restored, why human beings live under the shadow of possible ruin. After the waters withdraw, the survivor stands in a silence no person should ever hear. The land is changed. The familiar has become strange. Mud covers everything. Dead animals lie in reeds. Broken beams drift in pools. The smell is heavy. The sky is clear with a cruelty that only survivors understand. To live after such a flood is not merely to continue breathing. It is to inherit a command. Remember, memory becomes sacred because forgetting would invite arrogance. The flood tells every city that its walls are temporary. It tells every ruler that heaven can withdraw favor. It tells every household that stored grain can rot, that wealth can dissolve, that the known world can disappear in a single season of terror. Yet it also tells humanity that life can pass through destruction. A boat can carry seed. A warning can preserve a remnant. A story can outlive the drowned. In the quiet after catastrophe, offerings rise again. Smoke climbs from wet ground. The survivor gives thanks, mourns, fears, and begins. The gods are still there. The land is still there. The work returns. Canals must be cleared. Fields must be planted. Houses must be rebuilt. Names must be spoken again. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden beneath the flood silt of the ancient world. Was there one disaster that burned itself into memory more deeply than all others? Were there many, braided together by priests and scribes until they became a single cosmic event? Did survivors of real inundations carry their grief into temples, where lament became myth and myth became literature? Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. For now, the flood remains what it has always been: water, judgment, memory, terror, and rebirth. It is the ancient warning that the world beneath our feet is not guaranteed. It is the dark mirror held before the first cities, showing them how quickly order could return to mud. And somewhere in the silence beyond the storm, a boat rests, a survivor steps onto wet earth, and human history begins again. At the center of the Sumerian city stood a house too important to be called a house. Its walls were made of mud brick, its courts open to the sky. Its storerooms held grain, wool, oil, dates, fish, beer, tools, and offerings. Its inner rooms were washed, guarded, and entered with care. Its rituals were timed by tradition. Its accounts were kept by scribes. Its workers moved through dawn and heat beneath the gaze of divine authority. This was the temple. To modernize, a temple may seem first like a place of worship, a sacred building where prayers rise and ceremonies unfold. In Sumer, it was that, but it was also much more. It was an economic engine, a political theater, a storehouse, a landholder, a workshop, a dining hall for the gods, a center of redistribution, and a monumental declaration that the city belonged to powers greater than itself. The temple did not merely stand inside the city, the temple organized the city. Its estates could include fields, orchards, herds, fisheries, reed beds, and labor teams. Men and women entered its service in many ways. Some were administrators, some priests, some singers, some cooks, some guards, some weavers, some gardeners, some millers, some brewers, some shepherds, some dependent workers tied to institutional demand. The sacred household was vast, and like any household, it had to be supplied every day. There was bread to bake for offerings. There was beer to brew. There were garments to weave for divine statues and temple personnel. There were animals to tend. There were rooms to clean. There were festivals to prepare. There were accounts to check. There were deliveries to confirm. There were canals to maintain so that the gods' fields would remain fertile. Ritual and administration touched constantly. A sheep offered to a god was also an animal raised by someone, counted by someone, transported by someone, inspected by someone, slaughtered by someone, and recorded by someone. A loaf placed before a divine image came from grain harvested in a field, delivered to a storehouse, ground into flour, baked in an oven, and entered into an accounting system. A hymn sung in a sanctuary might be surrounded by the movement of rations, textiles, incense, and personnel. The sacred was never weightless. It had mass, smell, texture, and cost. One may imagine a temple courtyard in the morning. The air is still cool, though heat already waits beyond the horizon. Workers arrive with baskets balanced against the body. Donkeys stand under loads. Clay ceilings are checked. Jars are opened. Grain is measured by capacity. Scribes sit with tablets damp and ready. Officials call names. Somewhere within, beyond spaces most people may never enter, the divine meal is being prepared. The god eats first. That idea reveals the entire structure of the world. The best portion belongs to the divine owner of the city. Human beings receive, serve, redistribute, and depend. The temple's power lies not only in belief, but in its command of life's necessities. It stores what people need. It blesses what people fear losing. It explains why labor must be gathered and where the harvest must go. Some scholars have seen early Sumerian temples as central redistributive institutions, collecting produce and allocating rations to workers. The full reality varied by time and city, and the balance between temple, palace, household, and private enterprise shifted across centuries, but the tablets reveal beyond doubt that temple administration was formidable. Lists of workers, animals, grain, wool, beer, and land show a world where sacred institutions measured human effort in extraordinary detail. Here's the paradox of the temple. It lifted the city's eyes toward heaven, while binding its hands to accounting. The great temple platforms gave shape to awe. Rising above the crowded houses, they created artificial height in a flat land. They were mountains built where no mountain stood. From their upper levels, a person might see fields, canals, rooftops, smoke, animals, and the slow gleam of water under the sun. The building itself declared that the city had a vertical axis, a point where earth and heaven approached one another. Yet beneath the grandeur lay labor. Mud bricks had to be molded by the thousands. Reeds had to be gathered. Bitumen had to be carried. Workers had to be fed. Supervisors had to command. Builders had to repair damage caused by weather, salt, age, and neglect. A temple was never finished once and forever. Like the world it served, it required renewal. This need for renewal gave rulers a sacred opportunity. To rebuild a temple was not merely construction, it was piety made visible. Kings and governors presented themselves as restorers of divine houses. They boasted of foundations purified, bricks prepared, offerings made, old plans respected, and gods returned to proper splendor. In doing so, they tied their authority to memory. They became caretakers of an order older than themselves. The temple also shaped sound. The city did not hear only bargaining, animals, tools, and carts. It heard ritual music, drums, lyres, chants, lamentations, and processional songs moved through ceremonial time. Sacred sound marked festivals, grief, thanksgiving, and supplication. The gods were not served in silence. They were surrounded by human voices trained to praise, plead, and mourn. Among the most powerful figures were those who performed lamentation. In a world where cities could be destroyed, fields ruined, and gods believed to abandon their houses, lament was not weakness. It was a technology of sorrow. It gave form to fear and begged the divine powers to return. It allowed the city to speak when ordinary speech collapsed. Women also appear in the temple world in significant ways, though their roles differed across periods and institutions. Some worked in textile production, one of the great organized industries of Mesopotamia. Others held ritual offices or served within sacred households. The loom, the storeroom, the shrine, and the account tablet all reveal forms of labor often hidden behind royal names. Civilization was not built only by kings. It was woven by countless hands. The temple's influence reached into law and morality. Oaths could be sworn by gods. Disputes could be settled under divine witness. Property dedicated to a god carried special status. Theft from a temple was more than theft from men. It disturbed the sacred economy. Justice itself could be imagined as something watched by heaven. Yet temple power must not be romanticized. Where there are storehouses, there is control. Where there are accounts, there is surveillance. Where there are rations, there is dependence. Where there is sacred authority, there is the possibility that obedience becomes difficult to refuse. The temple comforted, employed, fed, organized, and inspired, but it also demanded. It gave the city a soul, and it measured the city's body. This is why the Sumerian temple remains one of the great paradigm breakers of ancient history. It forces us to rethink the birth of civilization. The earliest cities were not simply markets with shrines attached. They were sacred economies, built around relationships between gods, institutions, land, and labor. Religion did not wait politely at the edge of urban life. It stood at the center, receiving grain, commanding songs, storing wealth, and giving meaning to hierarchy. In the late light of evening, when the outer courts quieted and shadows lengthened across brick walls, the temple must have seemed both human and more than human. Its kitchens smelled of bread and beer. Its storerooms held the city's substance. Its priests guarded gestures older than memory. Its scribes placed numbers into clay. Its statues looked out with inhuman stillness. The temple was the city's heart, but not a soft heart. It beat with offerings, accounts, prayers, labor, and power. Beyond the temple courts and royal inscriptions, Sumer was filled with ordinary noise. A door scraped open before sunrise. A dog barked in a narrow street. A mother called a child back from the threshold. A potter tested the dampness of clay between his fingers. A brewer bent over a vat, breathing in the warm smell of fermentation. A weaver checked the tension of thread. A merchant argued over weight, quality, and payment. Somewhere nearby, a scribe sharpened the end of a reed and prepared to make a private quarrel permanent. This is where Sumer becomes most human. The greatness of its civilization is often described through cities, gods, kings, wars, and monuments. But the tablets also open windows into smaller lives. They show us that the first civilization was not only built by rulers commanding from above, it was inhabited by people buying houses, borrowing silver, adopting children, arranging marriages, hiring workers, selling livestock, disputing fields, paying fines, brewing beer, learning trades, and worrying, as people have always worried, about food, status, family, property, and survival. The streets of a Sumerian city were intimate spaces, houses pressed against one another in clusters of mud brick. Many opened inward toward courtyards, making the household a private world hidden behind plain outer walls. There, grain might be stored, meals prepared, tools kept, cloth worked, and family rituals performed. The courtyard was a place of light in a dense urban fabric, a space where domestic labor unfolded beneath the sky. The home was not merely a shelter. It was an economic unit. Families produced, stored, exchanged, inherited, and negotiated. Some households were modest and crowded. Others were larger, with more rooms, more goods, more dependents, and stronger links to institutions. The house could hold generations, servants, apprentices, and relatives connected by blood, marriage, adoption, debt, and obligation. In its rooms, the great themes of civilization entered daily life: law, gender, labor, inheritance, hierarchy, and memory. Marriage was a social contract, not simply a private romance. Families negotiated bride wealth, dowries, obligations, and status. Tablets preserve agreements that reveal how carefully households managed unions. Marriage linked families, transferred goods, secured heirs, and shaped the future of property. Affection surely existed, for the human heart has never been absent from history. But the documents show the structure beneath affection. A marriage joined economic worlds as well as bodies. Women's lives in Sumer were varied and complex. Some worked within households, grinding grain, raising children, preparing food, managing domestic space, and producing textiles. Others appear in business records, temple labor lists, property transactions, legal disputes, and religious roles. Elite women could hold influence through family, cult, and property. Working women appear in ration lists, especially in textile production, where organized labor could be intense and demanding. No single image can contain them all. The Sumerian woman might be a mother, widow, priestess, weaver, debtor, landholder, brewer, servant, singer, or litigant before authority. Children entered the world of work early. A child in a scribal school faced discipline, memorization, repetition, and the pressure of signs. Another child might learn a craft by watching adult hands shape clay, cut reeds, tend animals, spin wool, or carry water. Childhood in Sumer was not the long, protected interval imagined in many modern societies. It was preparation for usefulness. Yet one should not imagine a world without tenderness, toys, lullabies, family burials, and the grief preserved in laments remind us that children were loved, feared for, disciplined, and mourned. The scribal school offers one of the most vivid glimpses of everyday ambition. Students copied sign lists, proverbs, model contracts, mathematical exercises, and literary passages. Their tablets sometimes preserve mistakes and corrections, allowing us to see education not as an abstract institution, but as a physical struggle. The student had to press the stylus at the correct angle, remember the order of signs, reproduce phrases, and obey the teacher. Scribal training opened doors into administration, temple service, commerce, and law. It was difficult because literacy was valuable. The world of commerce was equally alive. Merchants moved goods through city gates, along canals, across deserts, and toward distant lands. They dealt in textiles, grain, oil, dates, metals, timber, stone, wool, and luxury materials. Because southern Mesopotamia lacked many resources, trade was not a decorative activity, it was essential. The merchant lived by calculation, trust, risk, and record. A boat might sink, a caravan might be delayed, a partner might cheat, a weight might be disputed, a contract might save a fortune or expose a lie. Weights and measures mattered intensely. To measure was to create fairness, or at least the appearance of fairness. Silver could be weighed, grain could be measured, fields could be surveyed, labor could be counted in days, beer could be issued as ration. The world became negotiable through quantities. Yet every number also invited conflict. Was the measure full? Was the field properly marked? Was the worker paid? Was the debt repaid? Was the witness reliable? The courts and legal tablets show a society deeply concerned with order. People brought disputes over land, houses, inheritance, marriage, slaves, debts, injuries, and business agreements. Witnesses were named, oaths were sworn, Seals were impressed, judgments were recorded. Law in Sumer was not yet the same as later formal codes in every detail, but legal culture was already strong. The act of writing a contract made social promises harder to deny. Clay gave memory a public body. Debt was one of the sharp edges of daily life. A bad harvest, illness, failed trade, tax pressure, or family crisis could force a household to borrow. Debt could bind people into dependency. It could threaten land, labor, children, and freedom. Silver and grain were not just materials. They were instruments of pressure. Behind many neat tablets lies an anxious human scene, someone needing help, someone offering it at a cost, someone hoping the next season would be kinder. Beer flowed through this world as food, payment, ritual substance, and comfort. It was thick, nourishing, and common, made from grain and consumed through daily life. Workers received beer as part of rations. Taverns offered spaces of exchange, gossip, negotiation, and possible disorder. The tavern keeper, often imagined in later texts as a woman, stands near the edge of respectability and necessity, serving a drink that was both ordinary and socially powerful. In the low light of such places, laborers, merchants, travelers, and locals may have spoken more freely than they would in official courts. Craft production filled the city with touch and repetition. The potter's wheel turned. Clay rose beneath wet hands. Kilns glowed. Reed workers split and bound stems into mats, baskets, fences, and boats. Weavers sat for long hours transforming wool into cloth, a product central to the economy and trade. Metalworkers shaped imported copper and bronze into tools, weapons, vessels, and ornaments. Stoneworkers carved seals so small that entire worlds appeared in miniature gods, animals, banquets, heroes, and symbols of rank. The cylinder seal was especially personal. Rolled across wet clay, it left an image and identity in one motion. It could secure a jar, mark a document, authorize a transaction, or display status. A seal was a signature, an amulet of bureaucracy, a tiny monument carried by an individual. Its scenes reveal how Sumerians wished to be seen in relation to gods, animals, feasting, power, and order. In a world of clay records, the seal gave the person a repeatable presence. Food tied the city to field and marsh. Bread, beer, dates, onions, legumes, fish, dairy, and meat formed part of the diet, varying by status and access. The smell of baking bread, fish drying, beer brewing, and animal fat cooking must have drifted through streets and courtyards. Meals were not merely biological. They were social acts, marking rank, hospitality, household rhythm, and ritual obligation. To eat was to belong somewhere. Death entered the household as well. Many burials took place beneath or near domestic spaces, keeping ancestors close to the living. The dead did not simply vanish into abstraction. They remained part of family memory, requiring offerings, remembrance, and care. A house could therefore be filled not only with the living, but with the presence of those who had occupied it earlier. The floor beneath one's feet might hold generations. This closeness between life and death gave the home a depth that modern ruins can barely show. A courtyard was not only where grain was ground, it was where a child first walked, where an old woman sat in shade, where a marriage agreement changed a family's future, where grief settled after burial, where debts were discussed in low voices, where stories passed into the night. Ordinary Sumer was never truly ordinary. Its people lived under gods and kings, but they also lived under roofs that leaked, debts that pressed, illnesses that frightened, and hopes that flickered stubbornly. They laughed, drank, bargained, complained, sang, cheated, prayed, and endured. They were not symbols. They were persons moving through the earliest urban world with all the confusion and intelligence that human life has always required. The tablets do not give us everything. They favor transactions, institutions, disputes, and trained voices. The poorest and quietest remain partly hidden. Still, through cracks in the archive, they appear: the worker receiving beer, the woman listed among weavers, the child copying signs, the debtor seeking relief, the merchant sealing a deal, the family placing goods beside the dead. A civilization is not only what it builds upward, it is what it does each morning. In Sumer, morning came with dust, animals, bread, water jars, shouted names, measured grain, school lessons, legal quarrels, and the pressure of another day beneath a fierce sky. The first civilization was magnificent because it was sacred and royal, but also because it was crowded with human beings trying to live. War in Sumer began with land, not land as an empty surface, not land as scenery, but land measured by canals, fields, boundary stones, grazing rights, orchards, watercourses, shrines, and ancestral claims. In a country where survival depended on irrigation, a field was never merely a field. It was bread not yet baked, beer not yet brewed, wool not yet woven, offerings not yet placed before the gods. To lose land was to lose future life. So the city-states watched one another. Beyond each wall lay another city's ambition. Beyond each canal lay another ruler's claim. The plain seemed open, but it was filled with invisible lines, property lines, temple estates, traditional borders, disputed fields, sacred territories, and remembered insults. A channel diverted too far. A boundary stone moved. A grazing place claimed. A harvest seized. And the machinery of vengeance could begin to turn. Sumerian warfare was not constant in every place at every moment, but conflict became one of the defining features of the city-state world. Neighboring powers competed for land and water, and such competition gained sacred language. A city did not march alone. Its god marched with it. Its ruler fought as the servant of divine command. Its soldiers carried not only weapons, but the identity of their community. War was politics, economics, theology, and survival bound together beneath the sun. The battlefield of southern Mesopotamia was a hard and exposed place. There were no forests to swallow armies, no mountain passes to hide behind. The plain opened wide, broken by canals, fields, marsh edges, settlements, and raised tracks. Troops moving across such ground would have felt dust in their throats and heat on their backs. The gleam of spear points would have appeared above bodies before the faces could be clearly seen. Donkeys, carts, standards, and commanders moved with the formation. Somewhere ahead waited men from another city, speaking a familiar language, honoring familiar gods, but standing beneath a rival banner. War among sacred cities was intimate. The enemy was not always a distant stranger. He might worship a related deity, use similar measures, know similar songs, eat similar bread, and write with the same wedge-shaped signs. Yet this closeness made conflict sharper, not softer. Rivalry between neighbors can burn with a special intensity. Each side knows the value of what is being contested. Each side remembers old grievances. Each side believes that justice is on its own bank of the canal. One of the most vivid windows into this world comes from the famous conflict between Lagash and Umma, two Sumerian city-states locked in dispute over fertile borderland. In inscriptions connected with this struggle, one hears the language of boundary, divine judgment, violation, restoration, and punishment. The dispute was not presented as a simple argument between ambitious rulers. It was framed as a matter watched by gods, confirmed by earlier agreements, and defended through sacred obligation. Boundary stones mattered because memory needed a body. A border marked only in speech could be denied. A stone set up in the land, inscribed, witnessed, and connected with divine authority, made the claim visible. To violate such a boundary was not merely to trespass. It was to insult the order that gave land meaning. War could therefore be justified as restoration, even when it carried devastation. The weapons of Sumerian war were both practical and symbolic. Spears, axes, daggers, bows, helmets, shields, and protective cloaks appear in art and archaeology. Early wheeled vehicles, drawn by equids, may have carried warriors or commanders and added speed, noise, and prestige to the battlefield. Infantry likely formed the heart of many forces men arranged in groups, advancing with shields and spears, trained or summoned according to the needs of the city. Some were full-time fighters. Others may have been laborers turned soldiers under command. The sound would have been terrible. Wood against leather, bronze against bone, men shouting the names of gods and kings, wheels striking uneven ground, animals screaming, feet sliding in dust or mud near canals, the wounded calling for water, the victorious roaring when the line broke, the defeated running toward city gates that might close too soon. Royal art sometimes shows war with chilling order. Enemies are trampled, bound, stacked, pierced, or presented as offerings to divine justice. The ruler appears larger than ordinary men, calm in the midst of violence, an agent of punishment rather than a participant in chaos. Such images were not neutral reports. They were political instruments. They taught viewers how to see victory not as slaughter alone, but as rightful order imposed upon rebellion. Yet behind every formal image stood human ruin. A captured soldier became labor, ransom, humiliation, or corpse. A defeated city might lose fields, statues, stores, livestock, and people. Women and children were not outside the consequences of war. Irrigation works could be damaged. Harvests could be seized. Temples could be stripped. The economy of a city might bleed long after the fighting stopped. In a mud-brick world, destruction was quick, but recovery required years of labor. War also strengthened kingship. A ruler who defended fields, captured enemies, secured canals, or avenged divine insult could claim extraordinary legitimacy. Military success gave him wealth, workers, prestige, and narrative power. He could dedicate spoils to the god, build monuments, reward followers, and describe himself as shepherd who protected the flock. Failure, by contrast, could make divine favor look uncertain. A king who could not guard the boundary placed his entire sacred image at risk. Professional soldiers and organized forces likely grew in importance as rivalries intensified. Defense required preparation. Walls had to be maintained. Gates had to be guarded. Weapons had to be made and stored. Messengers had to move quickly. Scouts had to watch borderlands. Alliances had to be negotiated. War encouraged administration just as irrigation did. The city that could count grain could also provision troops. The scribe who listed workers could list captives. The institution that stored barley could feed an army. This is one of the darker lessons of Sumer. The same capacities that allowed people to build temples and canals also allowed them to wage organized war. Record-keeping, surplus, hierarchy, labor mobilization, metalworking, transport, and sacred ideology served both construction and destruction. Civilization did not replace violence with order. It gave violence new forms, new scale, and new justification. The divine banners carried into battle revealed the emotional depth of these conflicts. A standard was more than decoration. It gathered the city's identity into a visible sign. Under it stood men who believed their cause belonged to a sacred order. To see the enemy banner fall must have felt like watching a god withdraw protection. To seize it was to capture honor itself. Still, war did not erase diplomacy. Cities could negotiate, swear oaths, set boundaries, exchange goods, arrange marriages, and recognize agreements. The very existence of boundary inscriptions shows that law and memory were attempts to contain violence. But every agreement existed under pressure. Water shifted, ambition returned. Generations forgot or reinterpreted old settlements. A ruler seeking glory could find sacred reasons to reopen a wound. In the imagination of the ancient plain, peace was not the natural state of things. Peace had to be maintained like a canal. It needed clearing, reinforcing, watching, and repair. Neglected peace, like neglected water, could break its banks. At dusk, after battle, the plain would have changed. Dust settled slowly. Broken spears lay in the trampled earth. Shields were abandoned. The bodies of men and animals stiffened beneath the fading heat. Victors gathered captives. Scribes prepared to record triumph. Priests awaited offerings. Messengers carried news toward the city, where families listened for names. The gods had been invoked. The king had acted. The land had taken blood. War among the Sumerian cities was not an interruption of civilization. It was part of its formation, one of the fierce pressures that shaped authority, borders, memory, and identity. Sacred cities fought because they were sacred, because their fields fed gods and people, because their rulers needed legitimacy, because water could not be shared without rules, and because human beings, even at the dawn of history, knew how to turn order into a weapon. Under the wide Mesopotamian sky, the first cities learned that walls protect, banners inspire, and clay tablets remember victories long after the dead have no voices left. A storm rose from the north, and its name was Akkad. It did not arrive as a single gust. It gathered slowly through ambition, trade, rivalry, soldiers, language, and the hunger of rulers who looked beyond the old boundaries of city and field. For centuries, the Sumerian South had been a world of competing city-states, each proud beneath its own god, each guarding canals, temples, walls, and remembered claims. Then came a new scale of power. The old pattern did not disappear in an instant, but it was seized, stretched, and forced into something larger. At the center of that transformation stood Sargon. His later legends made him almost more than a man. They remembered him as one born in mystery, placed in a basket, carried by water, raised from obscurity, and lifted by destiny into kingship. Such stories are not simple biography. They are royal myth, shaped to explain how an extraordinary figure could rise beyond ordinary rank. Whether every detail is history matters less than what the tradition wished to say. Sargon was not merely another ruler among rulers. He was a rupture in the political imagination. He founded an empire. That word must be used carefully, for the early empire was not a modern state with fixed borders and uniform institutions. It was a network of conquest, tribute, garrisons, appointed officials, loyal governors, military expeditions, symbolic domination, and royal claims reaching across many lands. Yet compared with the older city-state world, it was immense. Akkadian power moved through Sumer into northern Mesopotamia, towards Syria, Elam, and the trade corridors that tied river plain to mountain, desert, and sea. The old cities had fought for borderlands. Sargon fought for worlds. The rise of Akkad did not mean the destruction of Sumerian civilization. It meant incorporation, pressure, imitation, and change. Sumerian cities remained important. Their temples still mattered. Their scribes still wrote. Their gods still received offerings. Their traditions still commanded prestige. But now they existed within a wider imperial order whose royal center spoke another language and imagined power on a larger stage. Akkadian, a Semitic language, rose in prominence beside Sumerian. This was not the sudden death of one culture and the clean birth of another. The reality was layered. Sumerian remained a language of scholarship, religion, administration, and cultural memory, while Akkadian became increasingly powerful in royal and political contexts. Scribes moved between linguistic worlds, names, titles, hymns, inscriptions, and administrative practices show interaction rather than simple replacement. This bilingual world is one of the great marvels of Mesopotamia. A scribe might learn ancient Sumerian compositions while serving a ruler whose court used Akkadian. A temple might preserve older rituals while answering to imperial authority. A local city might honor its patron deity while acknowledging the supremacy of a distant king. Culture became a conversation under pressure, and pressure often sharpens memory. The Akkadian kings understood the power of Sumer's sacred landscape. They did not rule only through soldiers. They ruled through temples, offerings, inscriptions, restorations, and divine favor. To dominate the south, an empire had to speak the language of holiness as well as the language of force. It had to present itself not as a foreign shadow smothering the land, but as the rightful guardian of order. Sargon's successors expanded and defended this vision. Among them, Naram-Sin became especially famous or infamous, depending on the tradition. His reign pushed royal ideology to dazzling heights. Art and inscription present him as a conqueror of extraordinary power. In one famous image, he climbs a mountain above defeated enemies, wearing a horned helmet associated with divinity. The king is no longer only chosen by gods. He appears almost godlike. This was a dangerous brilliance. For earlier rulers, divine favor had been essential, but the distinction between god and king remained charged and meaningful. Naram-Sin's image suggests a royal ambition that approached the sacred directly, whether we read it as theological innovation, imperial propaganda, or political necessity. It shows how empire changed the scale of kingship. The ruler of Akkad was not simply first among city rulers. He stood above regions, peoples, languages, and gods' territories, claiming a universal radiance no local king could easily match. Empire required roads of command. Messengers had to move. Officials had to report. Tribute had to be collected. Garrisons had to be fed. Rebellions had to be crushed. Governors had to remain loyal. Scribes had to record flows of goods, labor, and authority. Military campaigns brought plunder, captives, livestock, metal, timber, and prestige, but they also brought strain. Expansion creates distance, and distance creates danger. Every conquered city is a prize and a possible wound. The Akkadian state therefore intensified administration. The tablet became an imperial instrument. Seals carried authority. Officials acted in the name of a king whose physical body could not be everywhere. Local elites might be retained, replaced, married into, intimidated, or rewarded. The empire had to weave itself through existing institutions rather than simply flatten them. This made Akkadian rule powerful, but also fragile. A temple account might continue as before, yet its political horizon had changed. A governor might praise the empire while nurturing local resentment. A city might submit until weakness appeared. Trade and conquest were closely joined. Southern Mesopotamia still needed resources from beyond its alluvial plain. Timber, metals, hard stone, and luxury goods came from distant regions. Akkadian power sought to control or influence the routes by which these materials moved. Royal inscriptions boast of campaigns to far lands, sometimes in language that feels both geographical and mythic. The imperial imagination widened the world. Mountains, coasts, and foreign cities became part of the royal stage. To common people, empire may have been felt in uneven ways. For some, it meant new burdens, taxes, military service, labor obligations, confiscation, or the arrival of officials from afar. For others, it meant opportunity trade, administrative careers, protection of routes, access to imperial networks, or employment within larger institutions. Empires do not touch everyone with the same hand. Their glory and inscriptions often rests upon invisible pressure in villages, fields, and workshops. The empire also changed the meaning of rebellion. In the city-state age, conflict between neighbors could be framed as a boundary dispute or divine rivalry. Under Akkad, revolt became treason against a wider order. Cities that resisted were not merely enemies. They were breakers of imperial harmony. This allowed kings to describe suppression as restoration and devastation as justice. Once again, power dressed itself in the language of order, yet no empire is as solid as its monuments pretend. The Akkadian world depended upon charisma, military strength, administrative reach, and the cooperation or submission of many local powers. It stretched across ecological zones and political traditions. It faced pressure from within and beyond. Its rulers had to maintain awe over distance, and awe is difficult to feed. The farther the king's command travels, the more it depends on intermediaries who may obey, delay, distort, or betray. Still, the achievement was extraordinary. Akkad proved that Mesopotamian civilization could be reorganized beyond the city-state. It demonstrated that the techniques developed in the temple and city, writing, accounting, labor management, sacred kingship, military organization, and long-distance exchange could be gathered into an imperial project. It did not erase Sumer. It transformed the conditions under which Sumerian culture survived. In the imagination of the ancient world, Sargon became a model for later conquerors. His name carried the memory of audacity. He was the man who crossed the old limits, who made cities bow, who turned regional ambition into imperial destiny. Later kings looked back to him because he represented a new possibility, that one ruler could claim the many lands, that power could gather the scattered cities beneath a single name. At night, in the conquered south, temple lamps still burned, Sumerian hymns still rose, grain was still measured, children still learned signs, the gods still received their meals. But somewhere in the political air there was a new presence, distant yet heavy. Akkad had entered the old sacred landscape and placed its hand upon it. The First Empire was not only a military conquest, it was a change in the scale of thought. The city remained, but it no longer stood alone beneath heaven. It had become part of a wider storm of language, soldiers, tribute, royal ideology, and ambition. In that storm, Sumerian civilization did not vanish. It endured, adapted, and carried its ancient fire into a world now ruled by imperial winds. Civilizations rarely fall in a single night. They weaken by seasons. A canal silts and is not cleared quickly enough. A harvest comes in thin. A ruler demands more grain from fields already tired. A border guard hears rumors from the hills. A caravan arrives late, then not at all. A temple storehouse opens its doors to anxious officials and finds less than expected. Scribes continue to write, but the numbers become harder. More workers are listed. More rations are reduced. More debts gather like storm clouds over households that once believed the world would hold. The unraveling of the old Sumerian order was not one cause, but many pressures moving together. Climate was one of them. The land between the rivers depended on balance. Too little water, and fields failed. Too much water, and settlement drowned beneath flood. Poorly managed irrigation could bring salt upward through the soil, poisoning the ground that generations had trusted. The sun, so necessary for ripening grain, also drew water into the air and left mineral bitterness behind. In some fields, barley endured better than wheat, and over time the crops themselves may have recorded the slow stress of the earth. Drought did not need to destroy everything to change history. It only needed to narrow choices. When rainfall patterns shifted in the wider region, when river levels became less reliable, when pasture lands weakened, when harvests became uncertain, the result was not only hunger, it was migration, conflict, debt, political strain, and fear. People moved where food could still be found. Herds pressed toward better land. Cities guarded their fields more fiercely. Rulers demanded loyalty while their ability to provide security became more fragile. Environmental change does not strike a society as a simple blow. It enters the joints. It enters taxation. It enters wages. It enters temple offerings. It enters military recruitment. It enters marriage agreements, because hungry families make desperate bargains. It enters prayer, because drought is not merely dry weather to those who believe the gods govern fertility. It enters royal inscriptions, where kings boast of restoring canals, feeding the people, and returning order to troubled lands. Such boasts often shine brightest when disorder is near. The Akkadian imperial system placed additional weight upon this already delicate world. Empire requires movement. Grain must move, troops must move, orders must move, tribute must move, loyalty must move across distance and remain intact. When abundance is high, these movements can appear majestic. When pressure rises, they become burdens. A local shortage becomes a provincial crisis. A provincial crisis becomes a test of royal authority. A governor delays tribute. A city resents garrisons. A ruler sends soldiers to enforce what drought has made difficult to supply. The great imperial vision began to crack under rebellions, frontier pressure, and ecological stress. From the Zagros region and surrounding uplands came peoples known in Mesopotamian tradition as the Gutians. The texts often present them as destructive outsiders, mountain people who descended upon the ordered land and shattered kingship. Their image in later memory is dark, almost monstrous. They are accused of disrupting roads, weakening fields, and bringing misery to the cities. Yet the historian must listen with caution. Victorious and defeated scribes often turn enemies into symbols of chaos. Still, the Gutian incursions mattered, whether they were invaders, migrants, raiders, opportunists, or shifting coalitions taking advantage of imperial weakness. Their appearance in the records marks a period of instability. The old imperial center could no longer protect every road or command every city with certainty. The margins pressed inward. The highland and the plain collided. To the urban mind of Mesopotamia, such pressure was more than military danger. It was the return of wildness against cultivated order. Imagine a road that once carried merchants, messengers, and officials. For years, it had seemed dependable. Donkeys moved along it with textiles, metal, grain, and stone. Sealed tablets guaranteed transactions. Men trusted that the next station would be reachable. Then, rumors begin. A caravan is attacked. A courier vanishes. A group of soldiers is sent and does not return. The road remains visible, but confidence disappears. Trade is built not only on paths, but on trust. Once trust breaks, distance grows longer. In the cities, instability took many forms. A temple might continue its rituals, but with strained resources. A palace might proclaim strength while negotiating from weakness. Laborers might still receive rations, but reduced or delayed. Local rulers might revive older ambitions, sensing that imperial control had weakened. Archives would still be maintained, because bureaucracy does not end when anxiety begins. Sometimes it becomes more intense, as institutions try to measure their way through crisis. The collapse of a political order is rarely silence. It is often noise, more commands, more appeals, more records, more proclamations, more ceremonies asking gods to restore what human power cannot secure, more walls repaired in haste, more fields disputed, more captives taken, more names written down because everyone knows that something is slipping. The fall of Akkad, remembered in later literature, became a moral and cosmic drama. Stories told of divine anger, royal arrogance, desecration, famine, and the collapse of order. Whether every detail preserves literal history is less important than the pattern of meaning. Mesopotamian thinkers understood political breakdown as more than administrative failure. when a great kingdom fell. Something had gone wrong between earth and heaven. Such literature gives catastrophe a shape. A starving city is not only hungry, it is abandoned. A destroyed temple is not only damaged, it is a sign that divine protection has withdrawn. A defeated king is not only unlucky, he has failed in the sacred duties of rule. The collapse becomes intelligible by being placed within a moral universe, even if the actual causes were many, tangled, and painfully material. Drought, salinity, rebellion, overextension, trade disruption, highland pressure, local rivalry, administrative strain, divine interpretation, all these forces may have moved together like dark water through the foundations of the old world. The Sumerian cities did not vanish. That is the crucial truth. People remained. Fields were still planted where planting was possible. Temples still received offerings. Scribes still pressed signs into clay. Children were still born into courtyards shadowed by older walls. But the political order that had claimed universal strength fractured. Local powers rose. Memories of empire became warning and legend. The world had changed. In this period of transition, one can feel the resilience of Mesopotamian civilization more strongly than its weakness. Mud brick buildings collapsed and were rebuilt. Cities lost rulers and gained others. Languages shifted in prestige. Divine statues traveled or returned. Archives ended in one place and began in another. The machinery of life continued because people had no choice but to continue. At the edge of a failing canal, a worker might not have spoken of collapse. He might only have seen cracked earth, a tired overseer, and a ration smaller than last month's. A woman in a household might not have thought in terms of empire. She might have wondered whether stored grain would last until the next harvest. A merchant might not have declared the end of an age. He might simply have refused a dangerous road. History names the collapse. People live the symptoms, and so the old Sumerian world entered a darker passage, not erased by one invasion, not ended by one drought, not broken by one arrogant king, but transformed by accumulated pressure. Its sacred cities remained alive, yet they carried the memory of fragility more deeply. They had seen that kingship could fail. They had seen that empire could fracture. They had seen that fields, roads, and God's houses all required conditions no ruler could fully command. The earth had spoken in salt and dust. The mountains had spoken in raids and migrations. The tablets had spoken in accounts of strain, royal laments, and broken claims. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden beneath the ancient plain. The full measure of climate, conflict, hunger, and political failure cannot be recovered in a single voice. Only fragments remain, scattered like potsherds after a ruined feast. Yet those fragments tell a truth old as civilization itself. No order is permanent unless it is constantly renewed. And even then, only time will tell how long the renewal will hold. Out of disorder came one last blaze of Sumerian brilliance. It rose from ancient city of canals, graves, temples, merchants, and moonlit sanctuaries. There, amid the memories of earlier kings and the pressures of a changed political world, a new dynasty gathered the fragments of southern Mesopotamia into a disciplined and glittering order. This age is often called the III period, a final great Sumerian renaissance, when the old language, the old sacred geography, and the old dream of divine kingship were restored with astonishing force. The rulers of Ur did not merely conquer, they organized. Their achievement was not only measured in battlefields, though armies mattered. It was measured in tablets, officials, accounts, calendars, labor lists, tax records, messengers, provincial governors, temple works, canal projects, and the steady tightening of royal authority across cities that had long guarded their separate identities. They built a state that wanted to see everything, count everything, assign everything, and remember everything. The clay archive became enormous. This is one of the most striking features of the age. Thousands upon thousands of administrative tablets survive from the III world, many of them so precise that they feel almost modern in their intensity. They record sheep, goats, cattle, grain, wool, reeds, laborers, boats, fields, silver, flour, beer, leather, wood, and textiles. They name officials. They mark dates. They track deliveries. They reveal an empire of paperwork before paper existed. Here, bureaucracy became a monument. The kings of Ur understood that rule over many cities required more than heroic display. It required systems. Provincial administration had to be supervised. Taxes and contributions had to flow toward the center. Temples had to be supported and controlled. Workers had to be mobilized for building, agriculture, craft production, transport, and military needs. Messengers had to move through networks of stations. Local authorities had to be honored enough to cooperate, but watched closely enough to obey. The result was both impressive and severe. From the royal center, authority radiated across the land through governors and officials. These men managed cities and provinces, but they did not act in a vacuum. They were linked to the crown by obligation, marriage, inspection, military oversight, and record-keeping. A governor who controlled local resources could become powerful. A king who failed to control governors could lose the state. The Ur-3 system tried to solve this ancient problem through administration dense enough to bind the land together. At the heart of the restoration stood sacred kingship. The ruler was builder, judge, warrior, shepherd, and chosen servant of the gods. Royal hymns praised him with elevated language. In some cases, kings received divine honors during life, a practice that reveals the extraordinary height to which royal ideology had climbed. The king was not simply the manager of a state. He was imagined as the axis of order, the one through whom justice, abundance, and divine favor entered the land. Yet such glory had to be performed. Kings built and restored temples. They dug canals. They sponsored offerings. They participated in rituals of renewal. They presented themselves as guardians of the old sacred cities, not as destroyers of local tradition. Their power depended on appearing both universal and deeply rooted, both imperial and pious. They had to rule many cities while honoring the divine identity of each. Ur itself became a stage of magnificence. The great temple tower dedicated to the moon, God rose in solemn tiers above the city, its brickwork commanding the horizon. One can imagine the approach across open ground, the structure glowing in late sunlight, a human mountain rising from the plain. Workers had shaped and carried countless bricks. Officials had counted the labor. Priests had prepared the rituals. The king's name had been joined to sacred construction. The building stood as architecture, theology, and propaganda all at once. But the Renaissance of Ur was not only stone and brick. It was literary, Sumerian, though increasingly no longer the ordinary spoken language of many people, was cultivated as a language of scholarship, ritual, and royal prestige. Scribal schools copied ancient compositions, hymns, myths, lexical lists, proverbs, and royal praise. The language of the Old South became a vessel of memory, polished and preserved by trained hands. In classrooms, students entered a tradition already centuries deep. They learned not only signs, but a civilization's idea of itself. This is one of the most poignant features of the period. A culture can be most carefully preserved when it is already changing. The old Sumerian language lived on in tablets, ceremonies, and schools even as everyday speech shifted. It became sacred through distance. It carried authority precisely because it belonged to antiquity. To write in Sumerian was to join the chain of ancestral wisdom. To copy an old hymn was to keep a divine world alive. To master the signs was to become heir to the first cities. The schools trained minds for service. Students copied lists of professions, animals, metals, plants, places, and gods. They learned mathematics, accounting, grammar, model contracts, and literature. Education was rigorous because the state and temple needed skill. A poorly trained scribe could corrupt an account, confuse a delivery, weaken a legal claim, or offend tradition. The stylus was small, but the system depended on it. The Ur-3 state also produced law and ideals of justice. Royal inscriptions and legal traditions present the king as one who establishes fairness, protects the vulnerable, and sets order in the land. Such claims must be read with care. States often speak most beautifully about justice while relying on heavy labor and strict control, yet the language itself matters. It shows that rulers were expected to justify power through moral responsibility, not force alone. A king had to claim that he guarded widows, orphans, the poor, temples, fields, and lawful order. Labor lay beneath the brilliance. Many tablets record workers organized into teams, receiving rations, assigned to tasks, moved across projects, and watched by supervisors. Some were free dependents, some bound by debt, some prisoners, some institutional laborers, some women and children in textile workshops, grinding houses, or agricultural service. Their names appear briefly, often reduced to quantities and categories. Yet behind each entry stood a body that tired, a stomach that needed food, and a life caught inside the great machine of restoration. The state was magnificent because it was organized. It was harsh because it was organized. Textile production was one of its great engines. Wool moved through institutional channels. Women worked in large groups, spinning and weaving under supervision. Cloth became ration, trade good, tax resource, and marker of wealth. The beauty of woven fabric concealed repetitive labor. The tablet that records output does not record the ache of hands, the dust of wool, or the sound of many workers breathing in one room. Agriculture remained the foundation. Canals had to be cleared. Fields had to be surveyed. Oxen had to be managed. Seed grain had to be issued. Harvests had to be collected and divided. The old struggle against silt, salt, drought, and flood continued beneath royal grandeur. No hymn could ripen barley without water. No inscription could stop a canal from clogging. The state's power depended on the same fragile environment that had always governed southern Mesopotamia. The rulers of Ur tried to master fragility with order. They dated years by major events, victories, temple constructions, divine appointments, and royal acts. Each year name turned time itself into royal memory. The calendar became a chain of achievements. A person receiving grain in a provincial storehouse might date the transaction by the year the king built a temple, defeated an enemy, or installed a divine priestess. Thus the king entered daily accounting. His deeds became the framework by which ordinary time was measured. This is power at its most intimate, not merely soldiers at the gate, not merely statues in temples, but the ruler's memory inside the date line of a ration tablet. And yet the Ur-3 state, for all its discipline, was not immune to strain. The very density of the system created weight. Provinces had to produce. Workers had to be fed. Borderlands had to be guarded. Amorite groups and other mobile peoples pressed at the edges of the settled order. Elamite power watched from the east. Local ambitions remained alive beneath loyalty. The machine required constant motion, and constant motion demands fuel. Still, in its prime, the Renaissance of Ur must have seemed like the return of cosmic stability. Temples restored, accounts regular, kings praised, scribes trained, canals cleared, offerings delivered, cities linked under one sacred crown. The old Sumerian world, battered by empire and disruption, appeared once more in formal splendor. In the evening, a scribe in Ur might set aside a completed tablet, its lines neat, its numbers correct. Nearby, a priest prepared for ritual. In a workshop, women finished measured cloth. On a canal bank, laborers rested beside tools. Above them all, the temple tower held the last light. The city looked eternal, but eternity is a dangerous illusion. The final Sumerian Renaissance was magnificent, not because it lasted forever, but because it gathered so much memory into one last ordered flame. It preserved language, strengthened kingship, expanded bureaucracy, restored temples, and gave clay one of its richest harvests of records. It showed how deeply a civilization can remember itself. Even as the ground beneath it begins to shift, the old gods were still being served, the old signs were still being written, the old cities were still alive, and for a brief, brilliant age, Ur made the ancient South believe that order had returned. The kings disappeared, their armies dissolved into dust, their banners rotted, their palaces lost their roofs, their canals shifted, clogged, dried, or wandered into new courses. The voices of their officials fell silent. The cities that had once believed themselves chosen by heaven became mounds beneath the wind, their bricks softening back into the earth from which they had been shaped. Yet the clay remained. That is the miracle of Sumer. Not that it conquered forever, because it did not. Not that its temples stood untouched, because they fell. Not that its language remained the speech of daily life, because it faded from ordinary mouths. The miracle is that so much of its inner world survived in the smallest and humblest of forms. Tablets of baked mud, marked by reeds, buried beneath ruin, waiting through ages of darkness until human hands found them again. The Sumerians gave history one of its first archives of consciousness. They wrote down the movement of grain and the sorrow of cities. They recorded wages, offerings, lawsuits, myths, hymns, school lessons, royal boasts, proverbs, omens, contracts, and laments. They preserved the practical and the sacred together, as they had lived them. Because of this, they are not a silent civilization, known only through walls and graves. They speak, brokenly, sometimes obscurely, often through fragments. But they speak. Their legacy is everywhere in the later world of Mesopotamia. Babylon and Assyria inherited Sumerian gods, myths, rituals, scribal traditions, literary patterns, and political ideas. Later, scribes copied Sumerian texts long after the language had ceased to be common speech. Students learned its signs as part of elite education. Priests preserved its hymns. Scholars studied its word lists. Kings borrowed its symbols of divine favor. The ancient South became a cultural ancestor whose authority deepened with age. Sumer did not vanish so much as become foundation. Its stories flowed into later traditions like water moving through hidden channels, flood legends, divine councils, sacred kingship, underworld journeys, paradise-like places, heroic quests, city laments, and creation stories all continued to echo. They changed as they traveled. New peoples gave them new languages and meanings. But the deep patterns remained recognizable humanity under the gods, cities under judgment, kings under destiny, life under the shadow of death. The invention of writing alone would secure Sumer a place in the long road of human history. But writing was only one part of a greater transformation. Sumer helped define what a city could be. It showed that thousands of people could live together under institutions larger than kinship. It showed that labor could be organized across fields, workshops, temples, and public works. It showed that memory could be stored outside the body. It showed that power could be justified through divine language and challenged through the memory of justice. It also showed the cost. The Sumerian achievement was not a simple song of progress. It was beautiful and severe. Cities brought protection, specialization, art, administration, literature, music, law, and monumental architecture. They also brought inequality, debt, forced labor, warfare, surveillance, and the hardening of hierarchy. In Sumer, civilization appears not as a clean ascent into light, but as a bargain struck beneath a dangerous sky. The forbidden story of humanity's first civilization is that greatness was never innocent. Behind every temple platform stood workers hauling clay. Behind every royal inscription stood ambition. Behind every offering stood fields and animals counted by officials. Behind every school tablet stood discipline. Behind every city wall stood fear. The first civilization did not free human beings from burden. It gave burden meaning, structure, scale, and memory. And still, there's wonder. There is wonder in the thought of a child learning signs in a tablet house, pressing crooked wedges into wet clay without knowing that the practice would shape the destiny of civilization. There is wonder in a priest singing before a divine statue at dawn, convinced that the stability of the world depended upon proper praise. There is wonder in a woman weaving cloth that would move through temple accounts and trade networks. There is wonder in a farmer guiding water along a channel cut by generations before him. There is wonder in a scribe copying an old myth because the past mattered enough to be preserved. The Sumerians were not strangers to us because they were simple. They're strange because they were complex in ways we no longer share. They inhabited a universe crowded with gods, omens, duties, and sacred dangers. They believed cities could be beloved by heaven and abandoned by heaven. They imagined humanity as clay given purpose through service. They saw writing as craft, authority, and memory. They endured floods, droughts, wars, and political collapse with an understanding that order must always be remade. Modern archaeology continues to refine their story. Stratigraphic excavation reveals the layered lives of their cities. Radiocarbon dating anchors their long development in measured time. Lithic analysis traces materials across distance. Environmental studies recover ancient rivers, marshes, salinity, and shifting climate. Genomic data from wider regions adds texture to the movements and mixtures of ancient peoples. Each method brings light, but none removes the mystery entirely. Still, for the most part, secrets remain hidden. Some tablets remain untranslated. Some lie broken in museum drawers. Some sleep beneath unexcavated mounds. Some were destroyed before anyone knew their worth. Some truths were never written because they belonged to the poor, the enslaved, the defeated, the illiterate, and the dead, whose names were not preserved. The archive is vast, but silence is vaster. Only time will tell what future discoveries will be made. Perhaps another archive waits beneath the Iraqi plain. Perhaps a fragment in a museum will join with another fragment found a century ago, and a forgotten hymn will breathe again. Perhaps environmental science will reveal a drought more clearly, or satellite imagery will trace a canal long erased from sight. Perhaps a student will read a line no one has understood and hear, for the first time in 4,000 years, the shape of an ancient human thought. But even now, enough remains to humble us. Sumer teaches that civilization is not guaranteed. It is a fragile arrangement of trust, labor, memory, water, food, power, and belief. It must be repaired constantly, like a mud brick wall after rain, like a canal after silt, like a social promise after violence. The first cities knew this truth because they lived it. Their world required maintenance, and so does ours. The clay tablets ask us to look carefully at ourselves. We too count, record, build, worship, fear, organize, compete, and remember. We too create systems that protect and systems that bind. We too speak of justice while living inside structures of power. We too imagine our age permanent, though every ruin on earth says otherwise. The distance between us and Sumer is immense, yet the mirror it holds is painfully near at night, when the desert wind passes over the mounds of Uruk, Nippur, Lagash, Eridu, and countless lesser places. It moves across a landscape of vanished certainty. The stars shine above them as they once shone above scribes, kings, shepherds, mothers, priests, merchants, mourners, and children. The gods they served no longer command the world as they once did. Their cities no longer pulse with ritual drums. Their language no longer fills the streets, but the marks remain, small wedges in clay, human pressure fossilized into sign, a hand reaching unknowingly across time. And from those marks comes the oldest lesson of the city, that human beings are brief, but memory can be made durable, that power is loud, but clay may outlast kings, that civilization is born from both devotion and necessity, and that every age, no matter how mighty, will one day depend upon what it leaves behind. The Sumerians built with mud and dreamed in eternity. The mud returned to earth. The dream survived.